1. He knew about the unit. What is the unit? The Unit 731. Nothing much, just a laboratory of harrowing shenanigans by the Japanese during the Second World War. Actually, this was years before the Second World War happened since the unit was founded in 1935, and oh yeah, boy did he know about it. See, Hideki was Japan's war minister, so no shot that he didn't know about that. Given his position, he got more than hearsay about everything that went on in the lab. He saw videos of those harrowing shenanigans I mentioned earlier. What shenanigans, you ask? Think of it this way. John Kramer from the Saw franchise, except it's for biological warfare. This lab offed about 200,000 people in and out of the lab. That's how bad this was. And when Hideki was shown the proof, you know what he said? It was unpleasant looking. Or in basic understandable Japanese, doudemo iishi, toku ni kini mo shinai. That was about it. What investigations? What stoppages? No, he just didn't care. Oh, and before I go to the next facts, do you know why the Hideki Tojo was only the second biggest monster of Japan? Because the first one is Godzilla. Well, fictitiously, it's Godzilla. But if you're looking for the real bigger monster than Hideki Tojo, check out this video I made right here, and you'll know why he was only second. But do that when you're finished watching this video. Moving on. 2. He tried to erase traces of his regime, at least in the World War side of things. When the war was coming to an end, and the mighty Japan was about to crumble, Hideki ordered up a wild one. He told his men to eliminate all prisoners of war, like literally all of them. This message was relayed quietly through their military channels where it basically said, wipe out every prisoner if we lose or if they play hero. One journal from the Formosa POW camp dated back 1st of August 1944, it was said that the camp guards were allowed to do the eliminations by any means possible. In other words, have it your way, for as long as they're not going to be alive when rescued. Let me give you one example of this. It was December 1944. Japan was as good as defeated, but they weren't going down without taking some with them. In the Palawan Island in the Philippines, 150 American prisoners were taken to air raid shelters by their guards. Then the guards thought the shelter was a furnace and lit it on fire. If anyone ran out, they were bang-banged. Only 11 people survived there by using all of their luck. At this point, Hideki was basically going amok and metaphorically ripped the Geneva Convention in front of the whole world with this. 3. He was from a lineage of samurais. He was born on the 30th of December 1884 in the Kojimachi district of Tokyo, a part of the city where old families still held on to their proud titles even as Japan shoved itself into modernity. Tojo's bloodline came from the samurai caste, which, by that point, wasn't earning its keep slashing through enemies on a battlefield anymore. His father, Hidenori Tojo, had pivoted to the new way of military life, serving as an army lieutenant general. His mother's side had its own flavor of traditionalism. She was the daughter of a Buddhist priest, mixing old-school spiritual prestige with that good old-fashioned martial grit. So Hideki basically grew up in a house that was very Ronin 47 in vibes. 4. They weren't samurai-level rich. After the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, Hideki's family had to go freelance with their gigs. His father Hidenori used to serve as a low-level retainer under a daimyo lord back when that was the meta. Once the feudal system got dismantled, those jobs dried up fast, and Hidenori shuffled into military service as one of the few ways left to keep some dignity and food on the table. They had a family lineage full of warriors but no land, no wealth, and no political pull anymore. Hideki's mom, Chitose Tojo, was a strict disciplinarian and didn't exactly create a warm and fuzzy household. She pushed military values on him early and often, drilling the idea that loyalty and hard work were everything. Between that and watching his father grind through military life for scraps, Hideki got the message that the only way to claw upward in Japan's rigid society was through absolute devotion to the state and the army. 5. He was a workhorse. Hideki wasn't smart, but he also wasn't stupid. He was average, but that Mamba mentality of his made him work hard. And by hard, I meant that when he got to the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, he memorized every regulation, followed it, and put in the most effort compared to everybody in his batch. He clawed his way using sheer determination, and for someone in the military, that was a shining spotlight. He graduated, moved through staff positions, and got promoted because he was that robotic in his discipline. When the 1930s came, Japan more or less hijacked the government. Call a coup d'etat or what, but it was what it was. This was when his Mamba mentality was put rewarded so much. He rose through the ranks until he got the Vice Minister of War position, and it was entrusted to him because politicians knew that he was a stickler for duty who had all gas and no breaks in executing orders. In 1941, USA and Japan were starting to boil the pot, and Japan needed a new prime minister then and there. Lo and behold, it was Hideki Tojo. 6. He had a sharp nickname. Inside the Japanese military, Hideki had a nickname. It was Kamisori. It's spelled like this in katakana, and it literally translates to razor. It wasn't because Hideki liked shaving himself clean. Basically, it wasn't related to hygiene. He just had this robotic way of bulldozing through red tape. Let's interview one hypothetical officer who worked under him. Hello there. How was Hideki Tojo during meetings? Honestly, it was like getting diced up every time he gave orders. He was basically 50 steps ahead whenever he gives orders. For example, there was this one time where I came in with a report about the logistics of the weapons. I didn't even finish, and all he said was,
資金の 40% 艦隊に割り当てましょう.
Sometimes I feel useless. That's what the other guys would probably tell you. That's how razor sharp he was. Okay, that's about the time we have for this fellow right here, because I think he's about to reminisce more. Anyway, if your question wasn't in his concerns before you asked the question, he'd just stare at you like you didn't know what you're doing. When he took over as prime minister during World War II, that same razor attitude even became sharper, but I'm going to talk more about those later on. 7. He doesn't like weakness. Hideki hated civilian politicians to the max. He saw them as mold growing on the great Nippon Empire. Back when he was still climbing the ranks, he saw diplomats and bureaucrats as soft, spineless liabilities. He thought all their negotiating and treaty signing was a waste of time, and he made that opinion crystal clear long before he had any serious power. As far as he was concerned, Japan needed men in uniform, calling the shots right in the middle of the heat of the battle, not people in suits playing chess and checkers with their souls. He saw himself and other army leaders as the only people with enough guts to actually move the country forward, and everyone else were dead weight. The moment he got in any position of influence, like during his time in the Kwantung Army or later as Minister of War, he treated civilian leaders like white noise. The Meiji Constitution technically gave the emperor supreme power, but in practice, the civilian government was supposed to run things. Tojo basically ignored that and started using his military authority like a wrecking ball. One of his favorite moves was forcing the prime minister's hand. When his boss Konoe Fumimaro avoided clashing with USA as strategy, Hideki strong-armed his way through it. So, when Konoe resigned, Hideki swooped in as prime minister, and he got there because the government was too weak to stop him. 8. Bullying was his way of discipline. If drill sergeants normally just shout at you to get going, not Hideki. In fact, not the Japanese Empire. Most Japanese officers back then had this genius idea that violence equaled discipline. If a young conscript flinched or stumbled, it meant an open palm would be going across their face. Hideki argued that Japan's conscription system was pulling in dudes from farmer families and merchants' households, guys with zero connection to the samurai class. According to him, that meant they were soft, no bushido, which is the way of the samurai. So in his mind, the only way to stuff that samurai spirit into them was, you get a whack, he gets a whack, everybody get a whack. The logic was as cracked as it sounds, but it stuck. Officers across the board bought into it, and the army started implementing it. Hideki was literally hands-on doing this not only on lower ranks, but with the candidates too. Potential leaders also got smacked that all on the floor if they showed emotion or hesitation. The whole idea was that if you broke a man down enough, you could rebuild him into a tool, not a soldier with loyalty. If one of his men got hit and cried, that just meant he needed more of it. 9. He was a multitasker. In 1943, while Japan was still knee-deep in the Second World War and getting clocked in the Pacific, Hideki grabbed another job. Before this, he was already the prime minister and also the war minister. But he wanted as much stat padding in his resume as possible, so he also took on the education minister position. He needed to make sure the kids got a proper education too. And by proper, that meant one long love letter to the emperor, a whole lot of die for the country speeches, and zero room for things like individual thought or Western ideas. The whole education system under Hideki became a giant propaganda machine. He rewired the curriculum to crank out loyal soldiers instead of students. Reading comprehension turned into memorizing imperial rescripts. Science was taught too, but only the ones that helped Japan to win wars. Hideki turned schools into boot camps, and all the students or potential soldiers was taught is how great Japan was and how it's the center of the universe and could win all wars. Morning worship of the emperor's portrait was mandatory. Students bowed like they owed him their lives because apparently they did. Uniforms were militarized. 10. He was vilified in the West. During World War II, US actually drew Hideki in their posters. They drew him in a caricature way as Japan's boogeyman. Hideki's caricature was everywhere at this point in time. Walls, newspapers, comic strips, war bond ads, everywhere. And they weren't going for realism. He was usually drawn with grossly exaggerated buck teeth, round glasses, squinty eyes, and a smug little mustache, as if someone mashed together every racist stereotype they could think of and called it art. This and this and this are just some of the examples how Western countries portrayed him to the people. These images were designed to turn Hideki into the punchable face of an entire enemy nation. In the minds of the Allied public, Hideki was the Japanese threat. He became the walking, talking symbol of what Americans were told they were fighting against. Didn't matter that the Japanese military had a bunch of generals, admirals, and ministers doing their thing. Hideki was the primary target. Since they were going all in into their propaganda, the West put his face beside the biggest monsters of Germany and Italy. In fact, here's their caricature of the three. The US government and its media machine needed a clear-cut bad guy to make the war effort easier to sell. Hitler was already busy being the literal face of evil. Mussolini was getting clowned for being Hitler's sad little sidekick. But Japan? That was trickier. Culturally and racially, Americans didn't understand Japan the same way they did Germany or Italy. So, instead of explaining geopolitics to a war-weary population, they just turned Tojo into a cartoon goblin and called it a day. The wild part is Bugs Bunny and Popeye were out here roasting Tojo in animated shorts. Newspapers ran comic strips where he got flattened by bombs or tripped over his own sword. Toy companies made dartboards with his face on them, basically making him public enemy number 3. 11. Hideki was loyal to the emperor. He thought was doing the emperor a favor. Hideki worshipped Hirohito like a demigod in a uniform. The moment Tojo got any real power, he shaped military policy like it came from divine whispers. Everything he did, from mass mobilization to full-on war crimes, was framed like it came straight from the emperor's lips. Even if the guy coughed, Tojo would have called it a royal declaration. When he ran the Ministry of War, he didn't go rogue. He made sure it looked like Hirohito was running the show, and Tojo was just the humble messenger. Except he wasn't humble. Instead, he was obsessed with keeping the emperor's hands clean while doing the dirtiest work possible. When Pearl Harbor was being planned, Hideki worked overtime making sure Hirohito nodded to every step. He wanted it all signed, sealed, and stamped by imperial approval. There was this constant need to make sure Hirohito's image stayed untouched, like he was floating above the carnage while he was ankle-deep in war crimes. That's also why he didn't fight back when everything fell apart. When Japan lost the war and the Allies came knocking, he took the blame like a champ, but not for honor or guilt. It was another performance for the emperor. He tried to shoot himself in the chest and somehow missed his heart, which, considering how many people he sent to die, was some tragic irony. But even in court, he kept pushing the same thing, that everything he did was to uphold the emperor's divine command. 12. He won the early battles. Japan clapped Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 with a surprise attack. Months after that win, he was racking up victories so fast that even the top brass in Washington had to sit down and recheck their maps. This made Hideki's image in Japan skyrocket, all because his army steamrolled through Southeast Asia. It started with Hong Kong. Japan took it in under 3 weeks. The British forces stationed there barely had time to warm up their rifles before they were getting steamrolled. Then came the Philippines, where General MacArthur bounced to leave behind the mess and that whole "I shall return" line. They took Bataan, then Corregidor. The American and Filipino troops were either dead, captured, or stuck, walking the Bataan Death March. By the time Japanese troops were raising flags across Malaya and Singapore, people in Japan were treating Tojo like a rock star. Singapore especially was a big one. In February 1942, the British surrendered the entire garrison there. Over 80,000 Allied troops threw in the towel to a force less than half their size. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. 13. His war crimes slapped Geneva Convention across the room. During Hideki's time running Japan, the army tortured, starved, and executed civilians and prisoners like it was routine maintenance. The Bataan Death March made thousands of Allied POWs march for days in the Philippines. No food, barely any water, while Japanese guards beat anyone who tripped, got tired, or breathed wrong. A huge chunk of those men never made it. How would they? It was after a fierce battle. Japan won. Immediately after that, they made the soldiers walk 65 miles to face yet another tough time. All that while carrying their injured mates. And, over in Singapore, the Sukching massacre cleaned out tens of thousands of Chinese civilians, just in case any of them were thinking about resisting. As Prime Minister and Minister of War, he was the one pushing policies that let the military go feral across Asia. If you were a soldier under his rule and wanted to sack a village, kill everyone inside, and take their supplies, that was considered efficient. Starving civilians in occupied China, using slave labor from Korea, or testing chemical weapons on prisoners in Unit 731? Business as usual, and Tojo's government knew what was happening. 14. The crackdown. It was 1943, and Japan's reign is starting to wind down with all the defeats in Midway and in Guadalcanal. Some people inside the Japanese government, mostly Navy officers and civilian officials, started quietly raising their eyebrows at Hideki's fantasy of total victory. And to think that these officials were die-hard militarists, you know something is going on, and that something is not good. Hideki, being Hideki, took this mild pushback like an atomic bomb was dropped on him directly. He wasn't the type to reflect, compromise, or even blink properly when someone told him he might be wrong. So when word started spreading that some higher-ups were talking about negotiating peace with the Allies, he clamped down hard. He actively tried to crush it with censorship, intimidation, and raw bureaucratic muscle. Even when Tojo started getting intel that the war was sliding into catastrophic failure, he just doubled down. He believed if Japan could inflict enough damage, it might still force the Allies to negotiate on better terms. That fantasy was his security blanket, and he held on to it like a toddler. 15. Hideki briefly had more power than the emperor. You remember that part where I told you that he used to be a multitasker? He one-upped it even more. In 1944, Hideki had a little more than much on his hands. Prime Minister, War Minister, head of the Munitions Economic Mobilization Council, and finally Chief of the Army General Staff. He collected them positions like they were infinity stones, and that reference was appropriate because he had those seats all at once. Basically, he made himself the entire war cabinet. The actual trigger for this came from military gridlock. Japan's army and navy couldn't stand each other. Supply routes were a mess, munitions production was fragmented, and nobody was listening to anyone. So Hideki pushed through a new imperial ordinance, which was the Showa 19 Reform Plan. With that, he kicked out layers of competing ministers and forced all planning and strategy to flow through his office. That included raw material allocation, conscription, arms development, everything. Even education policy started getting passed through military filters. What made it worse was the way he treated civilian institutions. Ministries like finance and industry didn't really get a say anymore. They had to clear their plans with Hideki's Economic Command headquarters, which reported to, surprise, also him. 16. He had to resign because of pressure. On the 18th of July, 1944, Hideki walked out of power because it was around that time that the great Japanese Empire was breaking down. Well, breaking down is an understatement for sure. I mean, a little boy and a fat man were about to absolutely eviscerate 2 cities in Japan a year after he resigned. But going back, at a cabinet meeting that week, Hideki's ministers finally grew a spine and tore into his handling of the war. They came for him directly, picked apart every failure, and for once, nobody flinched when Hideki opened his mouth. The meeting ended and the message was loud. This guy had to go. But even that wasn't enough to push him. What actually cracked him was Emperor Hirohito. After years of letting Hideki run the show out of idolatry to the emperor, Hirohito stepped in and made it very clear he wanted a new prime minister. It was like et tu brute, but in Japanese. So when the emperor said that, Hideki, without a shadow of confusion in his mind, packed his bags then and there at the same day he got the memo. He even dropped all the other infinity stones of positions he had. 17. He lost his influence. Not long after he retired, he went from being the Japanese Thanos with having all the power and positions he's had to a Japanese. That's it, a Japanese. That quick. He holed up in Setagaya, a quiet neighborhood in Tokyo, where he lived with his wife and tried not to draw attention while everything around him was turning to rubble. I wonder how many times I've said that in the later part of Hideki's career Japan was going to ashes, but I'm gonna say it again anyway. By this point, Japan was about to go down. The Allies were bombing cities left and right, and the whole empire was basically running on fumes. While all this was happening, Tojo was just there. He'd get the occasional visit from hardcore military nationalists who hadn't quite gotten the memo that he was yesterday's news, but even they couldn't do much with him. They'd ask for his opinions, try to get his blessing for whatever nonsense they were cooking up, but it was clear none of it mattered anymore. The government had already moved on, and the emperor wasn't calling Hideki back by the looks of it, and that was the only person he basically barked to. As 1945 rolled in, the war was basically lost, and Tojo was just counting down the days. When Japan finally surrendered in August, Tojo wasn't part of any meeting, planning, or negotiation. He didn't even know the surrender had happened until after the broadcast. No one told him anything, and no one needed to. He had zero role in the decision. And by then, most of the people who once worked with him were either dead, captured, or trying really hard to pretend they never liked him to begin with. 18. Hideki converted to another religion. Hideki spent most of his life as a militant hardliner wrapped in layers of duty, discipline, and that crusty nationalist bravado Japan was marinating in before and during World War II. Born into a samurai-rooted family, the guy practically inhaled Bushido before breakfast. He was raised into Shintoist and Buddhist practices. When Douglas MacArthur signed the order to permanently put Hideki into an unconscious state, he changed his beliefs. By 1948, Hideki was a prisoner at Sugamo Prison, just waiting for the hangman. The same guy who barked orders and signed off on mass slaughter was now a convicted Class A war criminal. But while rotting in his cell, 2 American Army chaplains started paying him visits. One was Catholic, one was Protestant. Most prisoners blew them off or just smiled politely. But Hideki listened. Whatever flipped in his brain, he started softening around the edges. He read the Bible. He talked about guilt and forgiveness. He even got emotional about Jesus forgiving his enemies while being crucified. By some accounts, he took it seriously enough to actually convert. Not in some over-the-top televangelist-style epiphany, but quietly. Probably a smart move, considering the backlash it could have triggered in Japan, where Christianity was still viewed by many as Western interference. 19. He was scattered. After he was hanged in December of 1948, the Americans cremated his body at a crematorium in Yokohama. Then a couple of U.S. military officers carried the ashes in a metal container onto a plane and dumped the whole thing over the Pacific. Not off the shore, not near some island, but about 30 miles out. Like legit middle of nowhere. No headstone, no shrine, nothing. Just open water and silence. No one even knew exactly where until 2018, when someone finally got around to declassifying the file. Hideki wasn't the only one they did this to either. 6 other war criminals who got the noose at the same time got the same fate, which also precedes the fact that he has no grave. Technically the ocean, but not a formal one. 20. He respected the Jewish people. He detested the Westerners, especially the Americans. but not the Jewish people who his other buddy tried to exterminate. The Axis powers were expected to follow with the trend because that was the rule of thumb in alliances during war times. You're with them, so you believe in what they stand for. For not Hideki, he thought anti-Semitism was dumb, said it flat out. Germany whined when Japan floated the idea of giving Jewish refugees safe haven in Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Tojo greenlit it anyway. They called it the Fugu Plan. The whole idea was to invite Jews in, treat them well, and benefit from their education, business ties, and global connections. Japan never really had a big Jewish population, so there wasn't a long tradition of hating them for no reason. When Hideki rose to prime minister during the war, he kept that same stance. In 1941, just before the world blew up even more, he met with Jewish representatives in Tokyo. He looked them in the eye and told them Japan wouldn't be taking part in any anti-Jewish madness. Nazi officials tried pushing their agenda again. Tojo shut it down. He reportedly called that whole anti-Semitic ideology idiotic. Japan quietly let thousands of them escape to places like Shanghai and Harbin. By the end of it, over 20,000 Jewish refugees had made it to safety in Japanese-occupied zones.